Today's segment is going to be focused really on the history and context of land and contests over land in Buffalo and to some extent in the greater Great Lakes region. Before I get into the substance, I wanted to say one word on theme and then one word on format. The theme is kind of what I think is urgent about some of this material or the conversations that come out of it, and the many of the folks in the room, whether it's folks who've been leading land, kind of community-based land development, legal struggles for decades, or folks like Maria and Jocelyn who really have, and Keith, who have a lot of influence over the use of land currently, is that I think that we're at a really pivotal moment in our city and really beyond our city. And there are some elements of that pivotalness. One is that we know there are two great trends that are affecting Buffalo right now, or at least two that come to mind as some kind of overarching trends for me. One is climate change and the reality that the nature of our land and land use is already changing in our region. We can see it most pressingly along the lake fronts this year. But we know that there are much broader impacts coming, both because land will be needed for different uses for our survival, more use of renewable energy, and likely tighter, more dense residential patterns to support less energy intensive living. And the second is gentrification and the return to cities, both by people and by capital. So meaning that we're at this moment where we're sort of at the point A of a 4 or 5 point process that many other cities on the coast have experienced. And so we kind of have a template for the stages of it, and who's affected, who gets displaced, who benefits, and what the struggles over land look like in cities. So that intersection kind of runs throughout the material that I'm going to present. Related to that is the unique opportunity in Buffalo and some other Great Lakes cities in particular, heavy post-industrial cities, and that is the amount of land that is in public hands. You'll see early on in my presentation today that really in the history of Buffalo as an urban place, we haven't had that kind of comments since Haudenosaunee times, before settler colonialism took hold in this region. There hasn't been a commons of the scale that is currently held by the city of Buffalo and other entities. And I think it's really important for us to think about how to steward that land. And what I'm talking about, just for folks who may not know, is that because of deindustrialization and the decapitalization of Buffalo, thousands of parcels of land have defaulted to the city. The city was the only entity that would take them. Everyone else abandoned that land. The city, as our public entity, has stewarded that land for the last 10, 15 years when that demolition and that abandonment really took hold. And so we have some big policy questions about what to do with those holdings. And I'm not going to really speak directly to that today because we're looking more at history, but I wanted to say that up front because I think it's an opportunity that is really timely, and it could be lost. And part of what I'm going to talk about today is cities that had that opportunity, like New York City in particular, parts of the Bronx and the Brooklyn, were also in public hands, almost at the same scale that Buffalo is. And the choices that were made back then in the late 70s, early 80s led us not to kind of an equitable outcome in those cities, but into a highly gentrified outcome. So with that, last note on format. Typically, I'm going to do a pretty, what I hope will be a nice balance between lecture and conversation. Today, I don't know, because we're getting started a little late, it might be more on the lecture side of things. But I do want to, generally leave some healthy time for conversation. So with that, I think I'll get into the substance of things and leave room for. So last note is that there are people doing this work on the ground, like Ms. Barr over here fighting for community control of land, some of the street team folks. There are folks administering land or developing land, like there are also others who are professional geographers, historians of land. So that means chime in whenever you can. I'm really not an academic. I'm an organizer and a cultural critic, I guess. So I'm open to correction and supplementation along the way. So I already mentioned today is really focus on history and context, introduction to land history and urbanization in the Great Lakes region, with particular focus on our region. What I want to make week 2 is really look at current conditions and current contests over land and development, and current campaigns for community control. And then week 3 is really kind of scenarios and futurism, and how things could play out depending on power dynamics, on externalities, and so forth. You'll notice there isn't a week 4 yet because I'm still devising it based on a lot of material I had for my class at Cornell. But these are kind of the 3 building blocks of the class. So starting with a Phenom quote that I think captures both the material aspect of land, meaning why we need land as humans to survive, and also how that materiality leads to the spiritual and other kind of redemptive sides to land. So for colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and above all dignity. So this is the first map of Buffalo as a village, incorporated village, 1804. It is a map that was drawn up by Joseph Ellicott, and Joseph Ellicott didn't work, say, like Keith Lucas as a planner in the city of Buffalo or the village of Buffalo. He didn't work for a public entity at all. He didn't work for the state of New York. He worked for a corporation, and that corporation was a conglomerate of 5 large Dutch banking families, so from Holland, that had, in their minds, purchased all the land west of the Genesee River in New York State, what we think of as New York. So I think about 11 counties, or maybe 13 counties in that land area, something around 3.5 million acres of land. And when Joseph Ellicott drew this up, he was just been hired by the Holland Land Company, coming really from an apprenticeship with L'Enfant, the designer of Washington, D.C. He surveyed Washington. He was the surveyor of Washington with his brother. You can see some very European influences that we still live with in Buffalo, the radial street plan, the circles. And you can see parcels that we still think of as, that still exist, right, that are still on our maps today. And so it's, to me, it kind of represents, in a theory term, sort of the ultimate construction of land, meaning someone just drew this up. They constructed it out of their imagination and their learning. There isn't anything kind of even legalistic or official about it, other than his imagination at that time. And a crucial thing, which will come up on subsequent slides, is the proximity to Buffalo Creek. And why is that crucial? Well, when the Holland Land Company purchased this land, it was explicitly without extinguishing all of the land rights of the Haudenosaunee. And it was sort of left to Holland Land to negotiate some of those land rights. And what had been negotiated, and I'll speak more to this in a minute, left the Haudenosaunee with a series of reservations, including sort of what had become the home reservation along Buffalo Creek. And so Joseph Ellicott knew that as this city expanded, and even some of those parcels right up against the creek were infringing on even that agreement. And that agreement was sort of the tail end of a series of agreements that had already stripped the Haudenosaunee of a lot of land. So that encroachment and that sort of tension and expropriation of land is built into the really founding document of Buffalo, and sort of set it up for a series of conflicts.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
This was at the time when they were still using the wells for public water?
That I don't know. I don't know a lot about. Anyone want to answer that with any kind of certainty?
I'm just wondering if that made a difference in the way that they structured.
Well, what I would say, Denise, is that the siting of the city was really all about the juncture of the waterways, because lake freight, sort of shipping goods and services, shipping goods over the lake was already, even though this was a very remote village or non-existent village when Ellicott drew it up, it was clear that lake freight, so passage of raw materials from the west to the east along the Great Lakes, was going to be the wave of the future. And so that's why so much waterfront land was incorporated from the beginning. So that's a look at Erie County, what we now think of as Erie County. And the Seneca were really occupying a big stretch, a big swath of the land from Buffalo Creek southward to all the way to what we now think of as the Cattaraugus Reservation, beginning in the early 1600s, having been pushed by settler colonialism in the eastern part of the state away from the Finger Lakes and the Syracuse region where the Seneca really had a stronghold. So in the 1600s, had really moved to this region. So a few crucial things about how the Holland Land Company extinguished many of the Haudenosaunee Iroquois land rights. The official treaty was in 1797. It was called the Treaty of Big Tree, and that's what left the Iroquois with the 12 reservations that they were left with, including Buffalo Creek. But the leverage for that negotiation came about 10 years prior with the Sullivan Expedition. And the Sullivan Expedition was really one of the most gruesome scorched earth campaigns, and created a template for the displacement of native peoples that was later used in the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. So, as I was researching, I was astonished to learn that a full 25% of George Washington's army, the Revolutionary Army, or the American Revolution at the time, was employed in what was called the Sullivan Expedition of 1779. And it was for the sole purpose of burning down and displacing 40 villages of the Haudenosaunee. So they swept through the central New York and all the way up to what we would now think of as Geneseo, and burnt villages and displaced about 20,000, or almost all Iroquois people, many of whom fled to Old Fort Niagara up in just what we think of as Youngstown now. And you can imagine the effects of that displacement. So loss of land, meaning loss of food, loss of culture, loss of networks, and many Haudenosaunee perished at Fort Niagara, having been displaced there. I think it was I forgot what month, but it led into, I think it was October, so leading into the winter of that year. Many people didn't survive that displacement, but that kind of gruesome campaign created, obviously, tremendous fear of what the newly post-revolutionary regime would do vis-a-vis Iroquois land rights. And so when that's a picture of the Sullivan expedition. And all that's left in public consciousness or public visibility are a few signs at the villages that were destroyed. So this is Old Chemung. And that's Red Jacket, who is a leader, Seneca leader, and present at both the Treaty of Paris and the Treaty of Big Tree, which were land rights treaties, negotiations. And I think the point I'm making is that even though by 1797, that Treaty of Big Tree, there wasn't military action associated at that time in terms of threatening the Seneca or the rest of the Iroquois in extinguishing the land rights, but the memory of the Sullivan expedition was very fresh, and the entire infrastructure of the community had been destroyed 10 years prior. So there was very little power left to negotiate at that time, and that's what led to the loss of those millions of acres of land. There's Joseph Ellicott. So he, in terms of placing his sort of operation, he started off in a bar in what's now the Asa Ransom House in Clarence. That's where he was located. And there's stories of him actually going down into the bar. And so there were sort of travelers, settlers passing through Western New York. Very few number of taverns or places to stop at that time. So he'd sort of wrangle travelers coming through that bar, ply them with alcohol, and then convince them to buy some of his land and stay put. And that was his mode of operation in the early 1800s. A few years later, he moved to Batavia, built a more substantial office. But we're still talking about land that hadn't been cleared, no true streets, no true ways of passage. And the terms of sale were what we would think pretty one-sided. So Holland Land Company didn't transfer title or deed. They held on to title and deed until the entire debt was paid off. We would think of that as sort of renting to own. And that was important, and I haven't studied this in depth, but that was important politically because at that time only landholders had political rights. So what that enabled Ellicott to do is to create a massive political machine throughout all the counties of Western New York, because he could kind of determine which people got title. If they were allied with him, he could give them title early, let them pay off early. So
does that mean they were then able to vote?
Yeah, they could vote. They could be officers of politics. They could be elected officials. You couldn't run for office or serve on governmental, even a jury. You couldn't serve on a grand jury or a regular jury without being a landholder. So you can see the leverage that someone who could dictate who had title and who didn't could have. That was crucial because Ellicott is starting a whole new way of thinking about land. I mean, one thing I haven't mentioned, but maybe common knowledge, is that the Haudenosaunee and the Seneca and this part of the state had a very collective notion of land ownership. There were no parcels of land. So when Holland Land and Ellicott are trying to impose a whole new regime, a whole new way of thinking about land, they know that it's going to come with a lot of conflict. And they know that they're going to need the violence of the state, meaning armies, sheriffs, to enforce these contracts through eviction and through other legal means. So really, if you read the history of the land of the Holland Land Company, the first 30 years, it is one great history of conflict over evictions, contracts, renegotiation of contracts, renegotiation of interest, renegotiation of payment terms, and revolt. So there were the two biggest revolts were in Mayville and Batavia. Both times the land offices were burnt down. We're talking 700-800 people, armed people, running at the land offices, burning them down, and the Holland Land Company people flee temporarily, and then marshal the forces of the state to retake their office and to enforce the regime of private property. So, it's some really fascinating stories of how those revolts get started, often with the eviction of one popular farmer, which leads to a sort of word traveling that a farmer had been evicted, and people rallying to their side. So that is the picture up until the 1830s. Just taking one step back, and I had folks at least sent that article out around settler colonialism and its relation to genocide. I just pulled a few things out that I saw in that article as a summary. So in terms of distinguishing it from other types of colonialism, often in settler colonialism, the authority that has dominion or supposed dominion over the land, in our case, Great Britain, there's some religious or other types of sectarian differences with the actual settlers. So in the case of in the case of the United States, that would be a set of religious differences from and other philosophical differences from the Crown. What ties them together? Often a white supremacist ideology and set of practices and beliefs around the superiority of whatever the new settler culture is. Another distinguishing aspect of settler colonialism is the permanence of it. So, there's always some measure of attempted permanence of any colonial regime, but oftentimes the colonial functionaries are so few in number compared to the indigenous population that it doesn't necessarily seem permanent. In settler colonialism, there's thousands and millions of people taking the land, right, and they're taking the land permanently. So, in the article, it's just settlers come to stay, right? And then this was really stressed in the article, the seminal need to eliminate the indigenous population, in part for land rights, in part for a sense of cultural supremacy and sort of rationalization. And then just pulled out one sentence from the article too. Territoriality is settler colonialism's specific irreducible element, meaning that battle over land and territory is sort of at the center of the regime. So just one point to make, because it's in the context too, is that even in Great Britain, so the power that had the colonial authority in our context, there was still at that time in the 1700s a great conflict and contest over the meaning of land. That set of parcels that Joseph Ellicott drew up, where there's no public land and it's all little parcels that get bought and sold, that was hotly contested all the way up until the late 1700s in England. And that was because so much land was in common in England. It was called the Commons. And it was not just a park. It wasn't just like, Delaware Park where you go to, jog or play basketball. It was where people lived and farmed. And those were the two, ways that people survived. So it was, land that provided for people's everyday life and sustenance. And it was through the Enclosure Acts in the 1700s and a whole bunch of maneuvers before that, and because of the growing power of the industrial agriculture and the technology that was moving into agriculture that was sort of incentivizing the consolidation of land, that hundreds of thousands of people were moved off of those commons. And you can imagine, just as there was conflict in our context here in Western New York, there was a lot of conflict in that context. So, this theory of commons, whether it was Haudenosaunee or from Great Britain, had a lot of power and history to it that wasn't easy to eliminate. From that article that I sent out, I really liked this sentence as one of the sum up sentences, and it was actually him, the author, quoting another professor. Combine capital's interest in uncluttered access to land, meaning private capital, and the settler's interest in land as livelihood, and the principal momentum of settler colonialism comes into focus. So you've got these big investors like the Dutch bankers who are financializing land for the first time. They know what they need to get out of that land, what interests, what payments. That would be capital's interest. And then you've got these relatively poor settlers, or in some cases dirt poor, who are become part of that structure just to survive on their own, right? To farm and to have their own livelihood. And those two motivations between the settler and the big capital power are, what drives settler colonialism. So a quick look, at elsewhere in the Great Lakes. This is Detroit. So Detroit had an older history than Buffalo. It was a more substantial French trading post. And the French sort of had a somewhat hands-off compared to the British when it came to, they didn't have a lot of ability or settlers to kind of take the land, so they sort of had smaller trading posts. And that's what the tribes in that region were used to. And then when the British, after the French and Indian War, take control of Michigan, they have a different regime, in part because of settler colonialism and because of more people beginning to move into Michigan. And Chief Pontiac revolts, and so there's it's about a 2-week revolt in which they take the fort of Detroit back from the British. That revolt is put down, and there continues to be tribal and colonial conflict in that area. And then this is St. Louis, and to me this was a good, huge piece of learning for me as I went through this material earlier in the year. Also French trading port. I was aware of village culture in indigenous life, but I wasn't really aware of the scale of the cities that were built. So this is underneath St. Louis. It's Cahokia. It was in year 1100. The estimates are that it was bigger than London. So it was about between 15 and 20,000 people. It had an urban form. It had a governance that we might recognize as a sort of metropolitan form, and it had a dense settlement with everything we would think of in terms of a city. So it was Mississippian culture. We're talking way back in the 14th and 15th centuries. And that mound culture really extended all the way up. There are elements of it in Chautauqua County. So mound culture, Mississippian culture had a big footprint. But in this case, you can go visit. I haven't visited yet, but it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site you can visit. So just looking back at Buffalo and
Aaron, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
About with the European Commons? Did that, in order to create that, did you have to have a government in place? Who was creating and identifying it as a commons, as opposed to Joseph Ellicott coming someplace where we didn't have a city, where we didn't have that kind of local control?
Well, I don't know the history of the commons. Others may know, but I do know that it was
the legacy of the feudal system.
Yeah, it was a post-feudal legacy of that the crown recognized as part of the geography of the monarchies.
There was some kind of a government entity.
Yeah.
That was that recognized it.
Yeah, there was here too. So I didn't mention that this Western New York was officially part of Massachusetts for about
really?
60, 70 years.
Oh.
So it was under the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, then sold to Robert Morris, who was the richest person in Revolutionary times. He was a war profiteer. He financed the Revolutionary War and bought this entire region from Massachusetts. and then sold it to Holland Land Company.
Was there a presence of government officials?
Yeah, I don't. There was certainly a sheriff system, so there were ways of enforcing laws, and there were judges that were elected by landed folks. So.
Just as fair as it is today.
Yep. So just going forward a little bit, where we basic history of early history of Buffalo is that it remains a village, and Ellicott has some trouble convincing people to be here because it's still a village, and not huge prospects for growth. There is some water activity, there are obviously mills around, but it isn't until 1820s when it looks like the canal system is going to end up somewhere around here, and then the 1830s that there's a real reason to be here, and people start moving in great numbers. So the Erie Canal is the reason, and particularly the Erie Canal connected to the lake system, right? That's what gave Buffalo its unique positioning. A lot of the early history in the teens and 20s of Buffalo is between the folks who became elites and bought a lot of land from the Holland Land Company and were the rich class in Buffalo, and the Holland Land Company, conflicts between the elites around what should become of the harbor. So the local elites wanted Holland Land Company to build a harbor, to dredge the harbor, to build a breakwall, to make it a commercial harbor. Holland Land Company was trying to be on the cheap. They were trying to spend no money, and they also weren't taxed. So there were no, because they're so politically potent. That was another thing Ellicott did, was make all their land that they held untaxed. So there was no public money to build a harbor because they got themselves untaxed. They did eventually, and actually I'm reading Wilkeson Point was one of the first sort of harbor elites, got some harbor built. Of course, when the canal comes, it's boom time. Canal connects the lakes to the East Coast, via the Hudson. So the huge markets of the cities, Boston, Philly, New York, where everyone's buying things and producing things, to the hinterlands where the lumber, the ores, the grain is all coming in. And so we become the transshipment hub. That's why we have grain elevators to store all that grain coming from the west, from Minnesota, from the grain states of the time. And that creates a concentration of capital. We've got people making money. They need somewhere to put the money, so they start creating banks. And then you have a banking system that needs somewhere to put money, so they finance more development, and capitalism really takes hold in these parts. A little bit later in the 1870s, 1880s, this is a picture of not Buffalo, it's Lowell, Massachusetts, but we transition from the mill culture to the factory culture, and you start to get the beginnings of the proletariat, the working class growing, moving to cities in great numbers to work in factories, and that creates a class identity. It creates a common experience of working in factories, whether you were in textiles like these women, or in other factories. And Buffalo is a big part of that. The productive industrial capitalist region of the world, the most productive of that time, of the 70s, 1880s, 1890s, were our cities. That's where everything was made. The early bicycles, all the early metals, the early consumer products. And so I call those third wave, the first wave being coastal cities, the second wave being the Ohio River trading cities, and then the third wave being the Great Lakes cities, where people were flocking and capital was flocking. So at that time, 1870s, 1880s, you have this local elite class in Buffalo that's making a lot of money in factories. You have immigrants from all over the world coming to work in those factories. And you have folks that are trying to put Buffalo on the map, so to speak, the global map. And so a set of elites, meaning wealthy capitalists, decided, let's try to make our city like a European city. Everyone was going to, if you read those novels from the 19th century, everyone had to go to Europe to learn how to be cultured, right? To go to Paris or so. They thought, well, let's try to have a little Europe in our city. So they brought in Frederick Law Olmsted, who was the leading landscape designer of the time, and built on Joseph Ellicott's radial plan, and expanded the street plan to include these beautiful boulevards. And what's interesting, is at that time the notion of parks, and really this is primarily due to Olmsted himself, was one thing that you had to have, in part because Europe had the parks. A lot of the parks were actually a residual or vestige of the commons, especially in England. Even the Boston Commons still call the commons, right? So at that time, whereas Ellicott didn't include any public land really in his original plan, the Olmsted plan had some public land, had a commons. Now, it wasn't a true commons because you couldn't live there, you couldn't farm there, but it's sort of interesting, the tension between the interest of capital and privatizing everything, and then the reality that to be sophisticated and to have this sort of civilizing, what they thought to be a cultured type of city, you had to have beautiful parks that everyone had access to, and that's why we have those parks. One thing that wasn't public was the waterfront. There was so much money being made by private capital at the time. It's really kind of amazing to me that in Chicago, Daniel Burnham was able to convince the local elites to preserve most of the waterfront as public land, because it was a very similar city. But if you go to Chicago, pretty much the entire beachfront, lakefront is a park, a version of the commons. And you can imagine at that time the pressures to keep it like Buffalo's was private land.
And
Denise.
of course, an Olmsted Park that was in my community that eventually got mowed down and covered over and taken down, and it became the expressway. But from what I've read of that park, it was a top-notch park. I mean, they had brought in maple trees specifically for planting. It was supposed to be a place for great leisure. It was apparently a really beautiful park at that point. It was part of all of that.
Yeah, I think it's even on the map.
Ah, there you go.
And I got a slide for you, 3 slides from now, on that very topic.
Wow.
Same map, a few decades later. This is 1930s. In the Roosevelt years, one of the many programs that was launched was the Federal Home Act, which led to the FHA, the Federal Home Administration, and that was the birth of the mortgage as a popular financial instrument. There always were mortgages, but they were more for elites doing business with each other. Big landholders, or this really created a mass class of new people who could access mortgage. It got the mortgage, instrument down into the working class or lower middle class, and that's because the government backed those mortgages. It was part of the New Deal, and it created a whole new set of homeowners and a way of thinking about American wealth, because it became the main way that Americans save their money and build wealth is the home mortgage. From its onset, from that very earliest point of the American mortgage as something that a lot of people could access, it was explicitly a racist financial instrument. One of the enforcement mechanisms of that racism were the maps that the government had made showing where people could get mortgages and where they couldn't get mortgages. So if you know Buffalo history, you know that that area in the red primarily was the African American neighborhood, the Michigan corridor, what we now think of as, still the historic African American neighborhood. And this is the government map that said to banks, you may lend here, you may not lend here. If you lend in here, we won't guarantee we won't back up your mortgage, meaning no banks would do that, right? So redlining. It is it's the original redlining. It is interesting. So this is part of the West Side that had a class of very poor Sicilians and some African Americans mixed on the West Side. So as that way of building wealth and gaining sort of entree into the lower middle class takes off, no black people in Buffalo were allowed to do that.
What was that top red? It looked like, is that North Buffalo? What is that?
Oh, that's interesting.
It's Hamlin Park.
Oh, it's Hamlin Park. Okay. Yeah, so
That's how you can tell that it was race-based and not just class-based, because at the time, the downtown red was quite a poor neighborhood, as was the West Side red, but the Hamlin Park was not particularly poor, but it was predominantly African American. But as Aaron mentioned, the West Side part was predominantly Italian. It's worth thinking about how the definition of whiteness changes over time.
Yeah.
So at that time, Italians were not yet considered fully white.
yes.
But within a couple of decades, they were.
Great
Was it
point,
similar
Sam.
in other cities?
Absolutely, yeah. So this was a national set of policies, and you could see the identical map for every city of any size at that time. So yeah, so I brought this map out to make sure that it was emphasized that this isn't a historical phenomenon. It's a historical phenomenon that has massive impacts on our present. So this is only 5-6 years ago. This is the Evans Bank service map that they got caught with by the Attorney General. Had to settle. Probably not enough. But it's almost like the same map, right? It's except for the African American population is spread out over bigger parts of the east side. So this is like literal redlining. 2000. You happen to remember what year? 2012, 2013.
This is
2014.
Oh, 14. Okay.
It was filed, and
Okay.
data for every other bank that looks exactly the
Yeah.
same.
So, and the data, yeah, so John just made the point. So John does a lot of organizing, as do other folks in this room, around the persistence of redlining and versions of redlining. If you look at the data for African American mortgage lending by the big banks in this region, it's just shocking. Or
4%. 38% of the population, 4% of the lending.
So 38% of the population, 4% of the lending, to this day. So, so anyway, we've talked about this as a labor action. So, through a combination of these expansive government policies like mortgage lending and other types of wealth building, and through labor organizing, through, this is this Flint sit-in strike, also Great Lake City, kind of the revolt of parts of the working class against the factory system. You had a new class of somewhat well-resourced, primarily white people who were in the lower middle class, who wanted to buy things and buy houses and become part of consumer life in a way that the working class really hadn't been before. And real estate industry, banks, big developers recognize that demand and start planning urban regions around that demand. And part of what that means is developing more cheap land on the periphery of cities for almost exclusively white people who could get those mortgages I just talked about. If you couldn't get those mortgages, then you couldn't move out to the suburbs. And that led to a restructuring of the city. So this is, the parkway leading to the park Denise just talked about, Humboldt Parkway, right up against the neighborhood Sam mentioned, Hamlin Park, that was picked. So as the African American middle-class neighborhood picked for the destructive highway that ran right through the neighborhood, further eroding any equity that Hamlin Park residents had built up, and really, just destroying the feel of that community.
Can I ask
sorry.
you a question? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
I always forget to ask you, in your looking back, did you ever, I know there was a baseball field that was what they called the Negro leagues at that time. It was way back in the early 1900s, and it was supposed to be a really big deal.
Interesting.
In this area, and I always forget to ask you if you've seen any reference to
I have not. Now, Offerman Stadium was not far from here. That was where the NFTA garage is at Michigan and Maine.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I'll look that up.
I gotta go back and check it out, because I always forget about it. But I remember hearing that this was a big deal, this stadium that they had.
Yeah.
And they had top-notch players that played there. It was a big deal for Buffalo.
Very interesting.
Sorry, could you just back it up to that previous photo of the working guys? Okay, yeah, I just wondered it's a strange commentary on today's so-called decline of literacy, because these are working class guys, you notice, they haven't been to college and they're all reading.
Yeah, well, I think that, they might have been reading some Marx up there. Or, so that's suburbanization, right? Is the developers and banks and mall builders on the periphery drawing all classes of white people, working class, lower middle, not all class. The poor folks really, didn't have the resources to get mortgages, but from the working class on up to the Cheektowagas and Tonawandas and West Senecas. At that very same time, this massive impacts of the loss of work were happening in our region. You could call deindustrialization, closing of factories, altogether. About 170, 180,000 jobs lost. These were jobs that, because of actions like that one, started to pay decently, right? Super dangerous in many cases, either short-term or long-term. A lot of respiratory disease, a lot of cancers that came out of it, but they'd started to pay enough to get some people to the suburbs. And all of a sudden, that's all gone. Right, from the early 60s to 1983 when Bethlehem closed, that period, all that loss. So we have, and I should say by the mid 70s, in the heavy industry, in auto and steel, you had a decent amount of racial integration in the workforce. Often still a lot of racist hierarchies in the plant about who got to work where, but there were, at Bethlehem, African American, Polish American, a lot of other Eastern European working alongside each other in that plant. So when that plant closed, the entire east side and much of South Buffalo, obviously a lot of proximity to South Buffalo, was economically devastated and really hasn't recovered.
I was just going to say, Aaron, that picture in Lackawanna, today is September the 11th. Most of us remember, well, if we're old enough, we remember what we were wearing on 9/11. We remember where we were. We see it so vividly. The county executive who's from the city of Lackawanna and whose entire family worked at that plant, remembers exactly what he was wearing the day in 1983 when the entire thing was shut down. Like the rest of us remember 9/11. That was how collectively traumatic the shutdown was for the region. And just another quick anecdote, in 2005, when I was first running and canvassing the West Side and talking to folks on the West Side, I distinctly remember talking to an elderly Italian man on the West Side who still didn't have terrific English but easily understood, and he told me specifically about this plant and this experience, and he said, it didn't matter that I didn't speak English. I had a job. I came here. I was able to make a living for myself and my family. And I just bring that up because that's so much of what is challenged today.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I don't know if anyone's done a calculation about the total loss of wealth from the lost wages of those 180,000 industrial jobs that were lost, but it's just massive. And we know that the service economy that's replaced it doesn't begin to compensate in wages or benefits for these jobs.
I think it is like collective trauma. I mean, the region,
Absolutely, Maria.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One example might be that there was a certain point in Buffalo's history where Buffalo had so much money that they were able to loan money to New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a time when Buffalo was the 8th largest city in the country. It's now 88th. And Buffalo now vies for the 3rd poorest city in the country. Detroit is the poorest. Depends on what you look at. Some people say Cleveland, Ohio. Some people say Buffalo, New York. So
Yep,
it's a long
and
fall.
all those cities have very comparable industrial histories, right? All the
cities.
list of the poorest cities. Mindy and then Art.
I'm not incredibly sad about the deindustrialization, especially around that factory. Everybody I knew that worked there ended up getting sick.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's just the fact that there was no boom to follow or any
Exactly.
transition.
Yeah, it's romanticization of that area is dangerous, right? Because of the toxicity and extraction that happened. But I think the key is there's nothing coming behind it.
Right.
Yeah, it's a shame. I think the press needs to be educated better about conveying that in the present day, because you get Trump blathering about the great economy, when all he's pointing at is the index of stocks.
Right.
And the stocks, as we all know, reflect only the investment made by capital. And it's not a reflection, this is not happy days are here again. This is not the 1950s when a GI would come back from war, have maybe 1 year of college, go get a job, and within 2 years have a house and a car. Nobody can do that anymore. So it's terrible, but I decry a lot of the media coverage that we need to bring that difference into focus.
Right. Art, and then we
Here,
just move on.
If I recall correctly, your photo of the rise of labor, I think all the workers were white.
Right.
And I just want to connect that with what Sam said about the concept of whiteness changing. My family, I'm from Rochester originally, my family in the 30s and the 40s, you did not speak Italian outside of the house because you were treated so poorly. And Kodak would not hire anyone with an Italian last name until they were forced to hire Italian women in World War II. Because all the men are off fighting, including my Purple Heart father, and so that literally, as major a company as Kodak and what it meant to that whole region would not hire an Italian until they started hiring the women during World War II. But so similar kind of redlining, obviously in the labor force.
Definitely. So just the next phase of things. So we're into, a set of cities that are hyper deindustrialized and vacated because of both the job loss and the people loss to the suburbs and to the south. And this is a picture. This isn't Buffalo, but it's South Bronx, which was the most heavily industrialized part of New York. And I guess I put this here for a few reasons. One is just as a holding place for that experience of the 60s and 70s in cities that have been devastated. That word revanchism, in French just means revenge. And so one of the ways that the state, the government, the culture dealt with folks left behind in cities, primarily people of color, but also very poor, white people, was to, over-police and kind of occupy those zones. And that's sort of what's called revanchism in the literature on neoliberal cities. But at the same time, sort of those empty spaces, what I think, are in some ways the origin of this new commons that I mentioned at the opening of the day. This was kind of the new commons. There's nothing there. No one really is asserting private property rights anymore, right? In fact, they put their private property rights to flame in many cases, doing self-arsoning for insurance across the South Bronx and across many cities. And so you have, some space for experimentation, for new kinds of collective living. And if you look at the South Bronx and the birth of hip-hop at that time, that's exactly how it came to the fore. You had clubhouses in burnt-out buildings with people living in them all over, vacant buildings across the South Bronx, doing experimental art, music, and ways of living. And I think so it's not, there's a complexity to the story that sort of brings the pain of it out through a lot of new forms of expression. And I'm a big fan of not forgetting that Buffalo had a similar experience. This is DJ Warlock. I think it's PS 62 on Moselle in 1986, 87, so a few years later. But that's sort of the new commons in Buffalo, right? When abandonment hits, first the Fruit Belt, then kind of makes its way down into Broadway, Fillmore, down Broadway, down William, down Genesee, down Sycamore, and some of the same culture that's coming out of those coastal cities reaches Buffalo. At the same time as poverty intensifies, the police state intensifies, incarceration intensifies, and it's hard to find work that pays decently. What happens to the land economy is really just total collapse, right? So, land from that map that Joseph Ellicott drew in 1804, land had been a prime commodity in Buffalo, really kind of the foundational commodity. That was the first thing to ever be bought and sold in Buffalo, with those parcels that Joseph Ellicott drew up. All of a sudden, on a big part of the city, both primarily east, but also a big part of the west side in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, land doesn't have a value in the marketplace. It might have a human value, people still living in houses, but it doesn't really have much of an economic value. You could see that in the auction rolls, right? In the auctions through the mid 80s, late 80s, and 90s, a lot of land went unsold. And when I say land, I also mean houses on land. In some cases, that was what was creating the negative value, because those houses needed to be demolished. But because of that market collapse, that's where we get our new commons, right? It all goes back, and Keith has to figure out what to do with it at the city of Buffalo.
You're going to tell me, that's why I'm
Well,
here.
yeah. And all of a sudden, it's public land again, right? And it was incremental. Maybe, I don't know, a few hundred parcels the first year, a few hundred more the next year. I've been trying to get a great figure out of Oars. Maybe Sean or Keith or Jocelyn can help me, but we're in the thousands of parcels of city-owned land. We had some experience with Denise, still there, when we were doing the Fruit Belt organizing, the Fruit Belt Land Trust. There were 200-300 parcels just in that little neighborhood that were city-owned, right? So that's what happens. Should just note that these are toxic lands in many cases because of the lead, asbestos, mold, and other hazards. And just walking down the street here is dangerous. So don't want to paint a romantic picture of it, but nevertheless, it's there. So sort of the last component of the lecture is shifting for a minute to a parallel universe that I'm going to call the big capital cities for now, sort of the cities that always had these big financial sectors, and they're going to tell us a story that we need to be aware of about our commons. And the version I'm going to tell, this is a map of Paris in 1968, but really the story of gentrification could begin much earlier than that in Paris, all the way back to 1860s and 70s when Usman, a planner kind of like Olmsted, is brought in to clear the slums of Paris, which happen to be right at the center of Paris. So the slums, meaning the old medieval neighborhoods that we now were gorgeous, but they thought were ugly, with winding streets, and get rid of all those winding streets and put in these beautiful boulevards, and in the process create the Champs-Élysées, the space for not only the regional elite, but really the global elite, the people with money from all over the world to think of as their home, right not far from the banks of the river at the center of the city. And that sort of attitude or approach to Paris continued for decades and decades and really intensifies. This is a map of the late 60s, I think, or maybe it was by 1982, but it was a map that formalized the fact that people of color would be put on the margins, the periphery of the city. And in Paris, most of that were immigrants from Africa moving to Paris in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. And so this is sort of a form, again, sort of like that FHA map that I showed earlier, sort of a government document that formalizes a racist regime around land and where people go and where they don't go. It is the suburbanization of poverty in a map in Paris. And it kind of creates a template for where cities globally have been headed for the last 30 or 40 years. I should say some of that clearance, that Paris experienced in the 1860s and that our cities across the United States experienced in the 1950s and 60s also happened in Buffalo. There was an attempt, just like they did in the 1860s in Paris, to clear the center of city of poor people and people of color. So in our case, it was black people and Sicilian people were cleared out of two big neighborhoods. So Dante Place being one of them. Dante Place was Canal Side and moving towards the Lower West Side. Anyone remember how many blocks? About 40, 50 blocks of primarily Sicilian and some African American folks living on the docks where the houses were demolished, cleared. Some public housing was left in its place, but it didn't begin to account for the numbers of units lost in the process. And we have some living witnesses to this in this area. Joey Giambra, if you know him around town, has written plays about this. He's getting, these folks are getting up in years. I met another friend on the east side who remembers the clearance in the 50s too. Also happened on the east side, right? Ellicott Mall all the way down to Jefferson. This I have the figures for. It's about 2,500 families, mostly African American, cleared. So property taken, evicted, pushed off the land. Some public housing left in its place, but again, not nearly enough units to compensate for what was removed. And it was just sort of left empty. You can still kind of feel that emptiness in that zone. It's been filled in a little bit. In the Jim Pitts era, there was a lot of housing built in the 80s and 90s, but for the most part, it was just kind of left empty. You can, again, go see that. But the point in the Buffalo context is, at that time, there wasn't a lot of capital rushing in to put the rich, the wealthy classes in that zone. In Paris, the wealth moved right in. In Buffalo, it just sort of stayed in place as empty land. So looking to New York, where does this come in? So this is the part of the story of cities in the last 40 years. Soho was kind of somewhat akin to the South Bronx in its emptiness. It was it was the first wave of factories, so it was like way back in the 19th century. 1960s, 1950s, beat culture, 1960s, artist culture, starts to realize, wow, these places are beautiful. Someone thought they were ugly industrial spaces, but they're beautiful. In this case of Soho, kind of unoccupied and vacant. Let's move in here. It's cheap. And the most famous loft to this day is the Factory, Andy Warhol's loft in the 60s. A lot of artsy movies made there, a lot of art made for Seymour Knox and other people, some cool art made here. And it becomes, there's nobody cooler than Andy Warhol in terms of the fashion and the look. And so that is sort of a beginning of a narrative of what cities are. Maybe they're not just post-industrial factory, ruins. They're people that are doing cool things there, and that narrative is leveraged by people who realize the land is cheap. Capital banks and developers are always interested in cheap land, cheap property, because if you can turn cheap property into expensive property, you've made more money that way than any other way to make money. Right? So if you have whole districts that are cheap, dirt cheap, and you realize that they could be high rent, that is what banks and developers salivate over. And that's what they salivated over in Lower Manhattan, right? And they leveraged the story of art and the story of coolness and integrated it with concepts of kind of whiteness. Like this image, right? That is a place this is from the Lower East Side, which is a famous neighborhood again for sort of a Puerto Rican, African American, Italian culture that had been totally deindustrialized, impoverished, and through images like this and stories of what cities were becoming, it becomes the place to be for very wealthy, primarily white people. And there are tens of thousands in the case of Lower West Side, hundreds of thousands of people displaced in that process who had hung on through the lean years in those spaces and who weren't living in lofts that look like this. And sort of this is sold as a loft, right? Just as the Soho lofts were. So this is Sharon Zukin. So she's really one of the first people to write on the way that culture and art and narrative was leveraged for capital's interest in cities. Artists have been used over and over again since the early 1980s, really since the early, further back than that, as the legitimizers of a neighborhood in New York. And entrepreneurial artists, meaning people who themselves start out as painters, musicians, dancers, and who open a cafe, a bar, a restaurant, or even a co-op art gallery, they unintentionally develop the kinds of attractions that bring the middle class with some kind of cultural ambition. And sort of once you've done that, then folks with bigger development capacity, like developers, catch on. So I know we're running out of time a little bit, but just watch this clip.
Tell them not to worry about the interest rate. The interest rate hasn't moved 2% in 5 years. Talk to you later. So, how you guys think you did on the test?
Alright, I guess.
Most of those tests are culturally biased to begin with. The only part that's universal is the math. You boys must be hungry. I'm real surprised to see you down here.
Came to see you. See how you doing. How's business going?
Well, there's always business, just not always in here.
So like, what do you do, Furious? What, you help people get money for their homes or what?
Well, there is no or what. That's what I do, Rick. You boys want to see something?
Do we have a choice?
No.
walking around motherfucking Compton and all, man. Rick, it's the 90s. Can't afford to be afraid of our own people anymore, man. Did you two knuckleheads come home? Why don't y'all take a look at that sign up there? See what it says? Cash for your home? You know what that is? Good billboard. What are y'all, Amos and Andy? You step in and he's fetching? I'm talking about the message, what it stands for. It's called gentrification. It's what happens when the property value of a certain area is brought down. Huh? You listening? Yeah. They bring the property value down. They can buy the land at a lower price. Then they move all the people out, raise the property value, and sell it at a profit. Now what we need to do is we need to keep everything in our neighborhood, everything, black. Black owned with black money. Just like the Jews, the Italians, the Mexicans, and the Koreans do.
Ain't nobody from outside bringing down the property value. It's these folk shooting each other and selling that crack rock and shit.
Well, how you think the crack rock gets into the country? We don't own any planes. We don't own no ships. But we are not the people who are flying and floating that shit in here. I know every time you turn on the TV, that's what you see. Black people selling the rock, pushing the rock, pushing the rock. Yeah, I know. But that wasn't a problem as long as it was here. It wasn't a problem until it was in Iowa and it showed up on Wall Street where there are hardly any black people. Now, if you want to talk about guns, why is it that there's a gun shop on almost every corner in this community?
Why?
Tell you why. For the same reason that there's a liquor store on almost every corner in the black community. Why? They want us to kill ourselves. You go out to Beverly Hills, you don't see that shit. But they want us to kill ourselves. Yeah, the best way you can destroy a people is you take away their ability to reproduce themselves. Who is it that's dying out here on these streets every night? Y'all. Young brothers like yourselves.
What am I supposed to do? The fool roll up, try to smoke me? You shoot the motherfucker if you don't kill me first.
You're doing exactly what they want you to do. You have to think, young brother, about your future. Huh? Here's...
Okay, so that principle of
What is that a clip from?
that's Boys in the Hood. That's 1991.
1991.
You know, so it's pretty far back, right? So you know, the writing was on the wall in LA at that time in terms of the dynamics of cheap land and the contest over land. Neil Smith, who's the kind of academic authority on this concept of kind of basic concept of you can make a lot of money off of cheap land if you bring in wealthy folks, has this concept of the rent gap, and it's the disparity between the potential ground rent and the actual ground rent capitalized under the present land use. So meaning if you've got a piece of land, you put some capital into it and you can quadruple the rents. That's the difference between now and then is the rent gap. And across all of urban America, you can see that principle in action in terms of where developers are now putting their money. You can see it in Buffalo, right? It's right up against the medical campus. It's just west of Richmond. It's where property is cheap but could be very expensive. And so those calculations, the basic math of that difference drives a lot of development. Let me see where we're doing here.
Can I plant a seed just before I go? I'm sorry to interrupt y'all. I just thought about something that was real interesting that you may not remember. But for like 20 years in my neighborhood, there was a sign that sat off of Jefferson and I want to say on Best Street in an empty lot. And it showed a picture of this development that was supposed to be coming. And it sat there for so long. And everybody laughed because everybody was like, what is this? Why did, somebody put this sign up and never bought the property and nothing ever happened, right? Lo and behold, how did we know what was to come? Because nobody in the neighborhood was paying attention. But it's okay because we got it.
So I'm going to end with a few examples of those big market cities where the capital was flowing into the center of the city early on in the 80s, where there was some pushback, some community organizing, and some slightly different outcomes. This is one of the more famous ones. This is early on in the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. So Boston for a while was a city that was not immediately apparently one of the cities that was going to gentrify first, because there was a lot of industry in the city of Boston, and for a time, a big portion of the city looked like it was vacating. But by the 80s, the tech and education sectors had started to really boom, and it was clear that there was going to be a lot of displacement. So these folks in a part of just next to Roxbury in a area called Dudley, were in a neighborhood that had become the place where everything was dumped. So it was a dumping zone. A lot of demolition had happened. Landscape similar to parts of the east side in terms of vacant fields. And it was perfect when you have contiguous land like that. That's where developers can dream big for their development schemes. They want a lot of contiguous land. So there had been a private development proposed for a portion of this land that would have been high rent. Through a confluence of kind of coincidences, a foundation that had some church basis to it and a set of residents came together for a series of meetings around an actual community-based plan for the neighborhood, and came together to fight for it. So they organized. Boston had, because of the amount of vacant land in that city, had created a development authority, similar to our development authorities, that had ultimate say over this land. There was a organizing campaign, protests, messaging, and a lot of deep community planning around a community-based plan that would lead to affordable housing and homes that could be purchased by community members. They developed a really innovative and amazing structure of governance that you can find on their website still to this day. It had representation. It was a heavy immigrant community, so it had representation from each of the major ethnic groups in the community. What Dudley Street is most famous for in community organizing is winning the power of eminent domain, which I don't know, Art can tell us if any community group has won that since. I don't know of any, but they actually became an incorporated community association that had its own power of eminent domain.
Was that granted to them by this? Well, not granted, but they won that by virtue of the state. I mean, the state
Yeah,
had to
so
give them that authority.
I can't remember the whole legal machinations of it, but they were given the formal eminent domain authority, which enabled them to not only take the redevelopment authority's land, but also the private parcels that were holding out because they thought they were going to make a lot of money under the redevelopment authority. The kind of the proof is in the pudding when it comes to this kind of approach, because if you go to Boston now, one of the first things you see is it's a very highly gentrified city. It's extremely wealthy city, high rent. Dudley Street is one of the few zones of that city where it's still primarily people of color, and there's a lot of community governance and community stores still in place. So we're 35 years later, I think, from the time this started, 30 years later, and you can just visually and experientially tell the difference between where this kind of activity happened and where it didn't.
Do you have an after photo?
What was it?
I do. So a bunch of affordable housing primarily, and then some parks. A lot of it was first-time homebuyer housing, so it was, but with covenants, land trust type covenants on resale. So you can get after pictures on their website. I forgot to put one in there. I'm gonna play 10 seconds of this video just for that, because it's just one of the most visually amazing things. Maybe Christian can speak to this too. So that's part of the South Bronx in around 1980. Again, one of the most deindustrialized, vacated parts of the city. A lot of it through arson, whether it was landlord arson or not. And the example that I came with today. Sorry, Christian, if you want to.
Yeah, just to think about the fact that maybe even hundreds of families have been burned due to the fact of landlords owning buildings, actually burning those buildings just to get their insurance claims. South Bronx looked like shit. If you go now, they're calling it downtown Bronx, not even South Bronx anymore. They're selling condos now for over $450,000 in a place where there was nothing but affordable housing. It's kind of scary to think about all those lots, because I was born in '86, so I just saw when they just finished cleaning up all the bricks and all this, it was just a lot of vacant lots. But you heard about in the '80s the fact that all these buildings that used to be here and all the families, there was even more people. Now there's buildings there, but they're all luxury buildings. I don't know, it's kind of scary to think though that we lost a lot of people and it was all about capital. That's what I'm going to say.
No, thank you very much for that, Christian. And so again, that was a time, because of that level of vacancy and arson and devastation, where a lot of land defaulted to the city, tens of thousands of parcels. There was an authority set up to govern it, but it was mostly focused on disposition and getting rid of it. There was a fair amount of affordable housing built, but not enough. The example that I bring today, I won't be able to show the movie clip, but Banana Kelly began as a grassroots effort in part of the South Bronx in vacant buildings on, forgot what street, but it was a street that looks like a banana. I don't know if you remember, Christian. Late 70s, it was a sweat equity project of just claiming control, physical control, living in buildings, squatting in buildings. And then kind of it started to get some resources for more formal affordable housing. And I know by the 90s or 2000s, it was seen as sort of being more like somewhat of a problematic organization in terms of its governance and whether it had sold out or not. But the point is that it was a community-based effort that built several thousands of affordable housing units because it claimed land early on at this time. I won't show that because we're out of time. But another one is just in Lower East, in the East Village. This is more kind of anarchist squatter struggles taking over vacant buildings around Tompkins Square Park. That was, those struggles lasted all the way up until the 90s, too, of people claiming physical control over buildings. Jen Kaminsky, who works for Push now, experienced a lot. She was in New York in the late 90s, early 2000s, working for an organization that was helping squatter tenants, turn some of these buildings into cooperative housing. And again, thousands of units were preserved because of this organizing in the East Village and the Lower East Side. And there was sort of transition from informal squatting to more formalized affordable housing. A lot of it was lost, too, as you can imagine, to some of the highest rents in the country at this point. Last example, just historical from the big cities. This is Mel King, a big figure in Boston. Another part of Boston it's called the South End, had vacated beautiful brick homes. By the 70s, it's clear that wealthier folks are moving back in. Some developers are moving in, and Mel King helps to organize a community-based movement to preserve affordable housing. They created Tent City. This was also accompanied by a lot of urban renewal kind of clearance activity. And again, the South End definitely gentrified. It was really close to downtown, right in the kind of the shadow of the Hancock building. But because of this struggle, there were probably 800-900 affordable housing units built in the South End that are still there today. So you can walk around that neighborhood and experience the legacy of that struggle today, despite the fact that it is a very, very wealthy neighborhood. So I just, this isn't a comprehensive list, but just from those examples, what did people do to preserve that affordable housing? Almost always there was some occupation of abandoned land and buildings, meaning people lived, squatted in those buildings, marked those buildings as community controlled somehow. Also, almost always some kind of protest that targeted either the redevelopment authorities or the banks or government actors proposing a more community-based plan to a plan that was not community-based. Oftentimes, as in the case of Banana Kelly and Dudley Street, there was a version of a land trust established to hold the land that was won in perpetuity. And then also oftentimes there was a focus on the rules for the disposition of publicly held land, a focus on affordability requirements, who could buy the land, what the community had to say about that. Unfortunately, no city had those policies in place that I know of citywide in a strong way. It was often more spatial, focused on specific neighborhoods. So, vast amounts of New York and Boston were sold off to high rent developers in the 80s and 90s. And so, very last segment here is just sort of looking at the last 10 years, getting us up to the present for next time. But the highly gentrified cities are almost entirely on the coasts. Kind of know that. I forgot which study, honestly, who did this study, but it was counting the intensity of neighborhood gentrification. You have some examples where there was a lot of capital in a place like Chicago. And the effects of that are just kind of very clearly felt most intensely by people of color, particularly black people in cities. So where is it? I thought I had the key to this. But this is a key. Basically, this picture, map of New York, the intensity of the red shows the number of black people lost in that part of the city. And the blue, Brooklyn, the Bronx, right? So really, the entirety of the interior, the core of the city. You can see the suburbanization and extreme outer borough trend. So this is like the Rockaways, where Robert Moses had already put a lot of poor people. And then that's parts of Long Island, the interior parts. So it's a map that for me really strongly resembles that map of Paris that I showed, where people of color are on the outskirts. Another map similar of San Francisco. There's a commercial movie or a semi-artsy commercial movie out right now called The Last Black Man in San Francisco. Black population of San Francisco is down to 2%, and it's people, poor people of color pushed out to outlying zones. I just had a friend visit me from Boston, a guy that I did a lot of labor organizing with, who's a cook in the Harvard dining halls. He said when he started 40 years ago, the entire workforce of he cooks at Harvard was living in Somerville and Cambridge and walking to work. Now he's the head union guy, so he knows everybody. He says he's one of a handful of people living within Boston or Cambridge, and the average commute is an hour and a half to work. And so that's, you got to live in, even beyond Lowell and Lawrence, you got to go to Rhode Island or New Hampshire, and that's where he said people are living. So that trend has really taken hold on all the coastal cities. I don't know exactly how I put this in, but this is sort of getting us up for next class to the very current. This opened in New York, like Hudson Yards, about 3 months ago. It is like just the epitome of complete corporate control of space. It's owned by hedge funds. you can like feel the money being extracted from you when you walk into the space.
Where is this?
It's Hudson Yards in Manhattan, on the up against the rail yards near Chelsea. So, it was all built at once. All the stores in there are luxury stores. There's not even community-based business. There's no business that isn't owned by a hedge fund in there. And there's a big mall. There's an ugly art piece that everyone thinks is great that's attracting people to go look at. So that's, I think, the
$3 billion in tax breaks.
Yeah, of course. So that's a great point. That's what we'll get to next class too, is the level of public sponsorship of this mode of development. So I think this is the uplifting final quote for the day. Today we are seeing a total class retake of the Central City, almost without exception. The new housing, new restaurants, new artistic venues, new entertainment locales, not to mention the new jobs on Wall Street, are all aimed at a social class quite different from those who populated the Lower East Side and the West Side, Harlem, or neighborhood Brooklyn in the 1960s. So that is the mode of the coast, and I think next class we're going to turn more to Buffalo in the present and how we're seeing history repeat itself in our own context. Christian.
I just want to mention too, because I didn't hear it, but like even those red zones on how they're over policed now, and not only cops in cars, but they have cops just walking together in groups of 8, and putting like lights that are super bright that people have to get like really good shades, to the point that it feels like harassment in the South Bronx. It's the motors that run on that sound ridiculously, like people can't sleep. I just want to like mention that is part of the infrastructure that's being built to get our people misplaced, to make them feel super uncomfortable.
It's a great point, and that relates to it's a public subsidy of developers who are doing that, and it has terrible impacts on people.
I just know that we haven't seen this in Buffalo yet, but in a lot of the neighborhoods we work with in Chicago, they passed ordinances allowing more than 3 people to walk on one side of the sidewalk at one time, as a pretext for harassment in like neighborhoods around public housing between the University of Chicago and a lot of the public housing there. And again, obviously it was used racially, but like they passed laws that said 3 people could not walk on a sidewalk.
Wow.
I'm the same as Chicago. If you haven't looked into Pilsen, I was there a couple of years ago, the Pilsen neighborhood, and they're like hardcore fighting back right now against gentrification through the arts and different organizations.
Where is that?
Literally, it's a borough in Chicago that's predominantly Latino and a lot of Mexican. It's always been like a big Mexican population. And now if you go, it's a Mexican restaurant, but then it's also very swanky, like record stores, and on all the doors where the Mexican families still live, they have signs saying "Keep Pilsen Mexican," and they have like sprayed across the streets like definition of colonialization, and now they're doing a lot.
That's cool to know about.
We'll see what happens.
So I sort of, had some leading questions for discussion, but because we're running out of time, I think just I want to hear what people are thinking, if they have just remarks like that, that they want to share based on anything that they've heard today, examples they want to lift up, experiences like Christian, what you said, and then we'll close it out for the day, and next time have a little more substantial discussion.
I just want to make the irony that Ellicott Development, think of Joseph Ellicott, Ellicott Development for decades has been buying land cheap in the Cobblestone District, all around that area. And look what they're doing with it. And I mean, they've always thought long term, and so Palladino and Company have been doing that. Benderson did it for decades, but it's a similar thing. Buy that land
Speculation.
cheap, and you hold on to it. You claim it's worth nothing. You're paying almost no taxes,
right?
And then you turn it around.
Great point. Great point. Noah?
I remember just personal experience. Like when I did live in the food belt, I know I witnessed my mom working on the land trust and all kinds of things, trying to make sure that the people of the food belt were first knowledgeable to understanding what the process was that was coming to them. And second, finding resources and just encouraging people to see that they do have power. But with that, I'd also seen things like the strike force years ago, if you guys remember. Police cars would ride around flashing flashlights, trying to pick up anybody who city inspectors, I remember that they wouldn't even tell us. And I would just come home from school and I would see some guy looking around my house, and then next week we would get fined because like the garbage can would be out of place, so they would give us a fine of like $125 or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. So these little things that may or may not be told to people are all in this huge wave of just trying to push people out to the outskirts.
And just add, strike force is also the same force that had the traffic stops that we know were unconstitutional. But great point, Noah. It's organized. Other comments, and then I'll sort of give us a final charge and figure out where we're going next.
I just want to highlight Noah because he goes canvassing every single day. If you can talk about just some of the stories that you hear in the community.
Oh, that'd be great.
Just so that people can hear what's happening on the west side of Buffalo.
Yeah. On the west side, we knock on probably like 200 doors a day, if not more.
Something like that.
Something like that. And we have the chance to talk to a lot of people from a lot of different cultures and backgrounds. I will say, honestly, half the people that I talk to they aren't fluent with English. And so if I were to be able to get their kid or something to the door, they would have stories about them not being able to find jobs. And they would be scared because they don't know what would happen if, per se, the state would come to them and say that they have to raise taxes just like they did with the reassessment. One little story. But certain things, because they know the target and they know who's living there, so they feel scared of even being here. Like I've heard stories of people who were in the process of moving because they didn't feel comfortable. They didn't feel like they could find a job, and they didn't feel like they could make a living. Most of the people that I did talk to like that, like I said, need their kids in order to have that conversation to go back and forth. And then some of the times the kids don't even understand they're young. They're still going to school, so they only have the basic knowledge. Stories like that, definitely affect me. Even when I were to go, I would see stories of people without, just on my personal thing that came to my head. Just I remember I had met with an old lady. She was older. I think she was African, and I had talked to her about some of the things that were going on with our work. But then she had just keep bringing up the thought of since she's been around so many new neighbors who come in and out, she didn't feel like it was a community. She felt it was just like people, and it just didn't feel right. Yeah. Not having that sense of culture, not having that sense of community was something that sort of helps with that divide and conquer type mentality. Because if we feel by ourselves, then how can we be power in numbers,
So that's a great segue to, so next week we're really going to look at some current conditions, hopefully get some voices of folks who are experiencing current pressures in the room. So that's a great segue to next class too. Noah, maybe, do we have anyone else from, I see Mindy wants to speak, but Noah, were you saying someone else wanted to speak?
Well, I was thinking, I know I'm not the only person
who's on the doors, yeah.
Well, I know, I lived in Central Park for a few years by the Amherst Station, and so I seen the tear down of the space behind the post office, and I've seen the now building upon it that is this huge space that is honestly gentrification. They bought that space out for dirt cheap, they're rebuilding it up, and they're gonna use that to charge everybody else in the area a lot more in taxes, which is part of the reason why we had to leave, because our landlord was trying to raise the price up far beyond what it was actually worth. And so now I live in the Broadway Fillmore area, where you can't walk 3 houses down without seeing a vacant lot that's full of garbage that obviously hasn't been attended to in years, a home that's falling apart, et cetera, et cetera. And it's scary to think of I just tried to escape part of that process, and you look at the old Buffalo terminal and how much space is there and how dirt cheap it's going to be over there, because so much of that is still empty besides the main building, and then how terrible these lots are, that's the next spot. They're gonna buy all that up for dirt cheap because it's all empty, and they're gonna start that whole process way over there. And so it's scary to see the waves and how this neighborhood was fine and now it's not, and now this is the next neighborhood and this is the next one. And I lived in the west side, then the east side, Black Canisius, then to Central Park, now to Broadway and Fillmore. And so my whole life has been being pushed away from downtown because the gradual gentrification process has forced me to move farther away from where I was born, to find houses that have not yet been affected by gentrification. And at some point, that space is going to run out.
Wow.
So,
It kind of says it all. Last comment by Mindy, and then I'll let us go. All right.
I'm not gonna be at next week's class anyway, I have to go back to my crappy collections job. So, I guess what I wanna say here is, the space that's already empty, it's like a huge loss, especially, with Shoreline, them taking all those apartments out of the market, at the beginning of winter, and just seeing all of these, even these, you know, like, not really inhabitable houses being lost like this, and the rents are going up. But the thing is that there are companies here that I'm really concerned about that are targeting people who are living in these public housing. What is the Pine Harbor? There's a company that boots cars, and they charge $90 for you to get it back. If not, they put it into like a garage or something, and then each day the fees climb, and they're targeting people who are already struggling to keep these resources. Now, if you don't have a car, how are you gonna get to work? You know what I mean? How are you gonna get anywhere to do anything? And they wanna push people out of these places right now. We, you know, people who have a voice need to start standing up for the people who don't, you know what I mean? This company can't, when I said to them, you know, we're gonna make sure people know about this, they were like, man, we've been on the news, we're untouchable.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, you know what, I'm really sick of the corruption here. You're stealing from people, you're stealing their quality of life, you're stealing their resources, and we're all distracted by pop culture. People, this is a war. People are, they're losing their livelihood. That's death. You understand? People are sick out there. They can't take care of their lives, you know, because we've been poisoned, and now you got this guy just, you know, in my face about $90. There was another family there. They had 5 children. And he said, sir, I'm not going to have this money. And he's just like, pay up. You know, it's sick. We really need to do something about it. Keep your eye out. You're going to hear about these guys.
Thank you, Mindy. And you know, there is that whole analysis about the high cost of being poor, and you know, the fines and fees and the ways that things spiral through the system. So I will just make some departing words around, you know, for me, there are these huge questions, both the past, you know, what does the atonement or the reparations or the reconciliation process look like? You know, obviously we can't answer that in this room because we don't have representation of everyone who was wronged by the theft of land and the conflicts over land. But that question's very alive in this region. You know, when we walk around downtown, we're walking on Seneca land, and it's very, you know, it hits you in the face in a way that's kind of unavoidable. Same with the amount of wealth lost, you know, particularly to in the black community around the racist financial system. So there are, you know, a whole host of questions about the past, and then there's, you know, these big battles looming about the future. And I think both of those, I hope we can have a rich discussion on next time. So thank you for being here, participating,
Thank you.
and I'll see you next time.